Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are happy to have this exceptionally large audience here to gain insight on a very important topic. Earlier today, Governor Newsom delivered the governor's budget proposal. Always a highly anticipated event, but especially this year because of the important implications related to COVID-19 and how that has impacted California's K-12 schools. We are going to go in depth today to examine what that budget means for schools and what CSBA's response is in advocacy for local school districts and county offices of education throughout the state. Before we get started with that discussion, just want to take care of a few housekeeping details so everyone can participate in the event. You should see a module on your screen right now, which has several different menu items, including one that says questions, a gray bar about 2/3 of the way down the module. If you would like to submit a question, click on the arrow, which is currently pointed to the right on that bar. It will expand a window and you type your question into that window the same way that you would type an email or a text message. Hit send. We'll receive that behind the scenes and put it in the queue along with the other questions we received. There are more than 1,000 registrants for this event, so we won't get to every question, but we will try to group similar questions together so that we address all the major topics of interest. And if we still haven't answered the topic that you care about, please feel free to email us at csba@csba.org. You can also mail me at tflint@csba.org or go to our COVID-19 website. There's a portal there where you can submit your questions, and we'll go over that information again at the conclusion of the webinar. But with no further ado, I want to list our presenters for you. We have a great group that's going to provide a lot of important information. Many of you know Dennis Myers. He's CSBA's Assistant Executive Director for Governmental Relations. We also have Erica Hoffman, a legislative advocate with CSBA, who's a specialist in federal funding, amongst other issues. We have with us also Cheryl E. Day, a legislative advocate with a very strong background in finance, formerly of the Department of Finance, who will go through some of the numbers with you. And our external participants are Nancy Cherith Espinoza, who is a board member with the Elk Grove Unified School District right here in the Sacramento area. And also last, but certainly not least, Mackenzie Mays, who's a reporter with Politico, an education reporter focused on K-12 schools. Next slide, please. And so before we get into the panel discussion, we would like to have a brief statement from CSBA President Suzanne Kitchen in response to the governor's budget, outlining CSBA's position on what the governor presented today.
Thank you, Troy. Good afternoon. As your CSBA president, this will be my response to the governor's proposal. We appreciate that the governor's budget makes a significant investment in K-12 education, and we appreciate the emphasis that he's placing on those public schools, particularly his proposals to provide a 3.84% cost of living increase, eliminate 2/3 of the funding deferrals that schools were facing, and reduce the rate of school district contributions to employee pension funds. Those decisions will provide schools with some flexibility to meet the wide variety of student needs and extraordinary expenses during this time of crisis. Also at this time, the investment and the supports are not, in every case, sufficient to achieve the intended goals. While some schools will undoubtedly take advantage of the incentives to reopen schools this spring, others are not in a position to do so, given community health concerns, local standards, funding and resource staffing, and capacity limitations. We have work to do on both the school reopening and summer school plans before they make sense for all school districts and county offices of education. Thank you. And now I turn it back to Troy.
Thank you, Suzanne, for raising those important points. And I think we should note that the governor spoke for quite a while this morning, So we've really only had about 2 hours to comb through the budget, and our position will be fluid as we gain more information and remain in dialogue with the governor as well as the legislature. But we do have some immediate impressions, and I thank Suzanne for putting those on the table for everyone to consider. Now, to dive a little deeper into the nitty-gritty and some of the financials, I would like to turn it over to two people who know them extremely well: our Assistant Executive Director for Governmental Relations, Dennis Myers, as well as one of our legislative advocates, Cheryl Uday.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you, Suzanne. And we really appreciate our guests being here. So thank you, Mackenzie, and also with Nancy. You know, today really is the opening gate for the budget season. You know, we've heard from legislative analysts a couple of months ago. That's more informative than anything. Today, you know, the governor's release really is, it's official, and that's where the reactions really start to happen. So from this point forward, lots of legislative hearings, lots of backdoor negotiations. The May revision comes out the middle of May, and then the budget is adopted by the June 15th deadline. What we're talking about today, and one thing that Troy just mentioned is that, you know, while we've had a couple of hours to quote unquote digest this, you know, Cheryl and Erica just came back minutes ago from a briefing with the Department of Finance. So really some of this is minutes old. And so while we're giving you kind of a today view, as more and more comes out, then more and more details. So we're going to give you kind of a survey of issues that are critical to school board members and to the governance team to start thinking about right now. So I'm going to be quiet for a while and just let our budget lobbyist, Cheryl Uday, talk about some of the details that are in the January budget proposal that are inside Prop 98 and outside Prop 98. And then I'll be back a little bit later to talk about one of the proposals in greater detail. So Cheryl.
Thanks, Dennis. So the budget came out today, and the Proposition 98 guarantee is at $14.9 billion over Budget Act, and so that's quite great news, especially since we saw 13.1 when the LAO forecasted a few months ago. We have quite a few proposals, so I'll just go over them, and we don't have as much detail as we would like, but we did get a little bit. As Dennis just mentioned, we just got out a briefing with the Department of Finance. So good news, they're going to pay off 2/3 of the apportionment deferrals. One thing I really want to note about this is that CSBA, along with our pacers, we really listened to you and we heard your concerns about making sure those deferrals got paid down. And so we're really happy to see that the apportionment deferrals are being almost entirely eliminated. So we'll see all except for the June apportionment eliminated with this budget proposal. Also, they're providing a COLA, and not just the COLA for budget year, which is 1.5%, but also for last year, or this current year is 2.31%. So for a total of 3.8%. That's really important because that protects our buying power in Proposition 98 and the dollar. You know, if we're not seeing adequate raises, the costs are going to go up, but the amount that we can spend is still going to stay the same. So we're really happy to see that. That was another effort that we worked together with many of our colleagues in the ed circles to make sure that we sent that information to all of the folks in the Capitol and in the administration to know that that was something of effort that we would like to see in the budget. And here it is. So even better news. There's a proposal for $4.6 billion for extended learning grants. That's going to be for summer school, and if you want to do a longer school year to make up for learning loss. We don't have a lot of detail on this right now, but what we're hearing is that they want to get this funding out sometime around March. The funding will be centered more on an equity formula to make sure that those that are getting hit hardest by this pandemic are able to access these funds. There's also $2 billion for a reopening schools grant, and Dennis is going to go into that in much more detail in further slides, and so I won't say too much about that. I'm sure many people have heard about that, and we'll have a lot of comments as well. There's a $3 billion required deposit into the public school stabilization account, our rainy day fund. And with that, that triggers the school district reserve cap in 22-23. So that's something to be aware of, something for your CBOs to look at to make sure that you're prepared for that. There's about $315 million in professional development for teachers. That most of that is centered around one-time grants that address things that are around social emotional learning and equity, and a lot of the things that we've seen in the pandemic to help teachers get training for that. There's also $225 million for the teacher pipeline to address a lot of the issues that we have with many teachers, retiring, and just making sure that we have adequate resources to back up. $100 million that is non-98, and that's going to go towards the Golden State Award grants. Next slide, please. So this next slide is all of our current apportionment deferrals. This is what we see in statute. And so, we are going to have all of these paid off, and you see a 2.375, which is about 71% of the June deferral. We're actually going to see the full June apportionment deferred to July. And so you'll get that 30-day delay in your amount deferred to be paid back. And so it's that's just something to note, that it's not 71%, it's the full 100% of the apportionment that's going to be deferred. Next slide. So some other things to note, again, $14.9 billion over current year budget, and that there are, again, to pay off 2/3 of the June, July deferrals. Oh, this is next slide, please. Okay, great. So some other things that we saw in the budget is there's $300 million for early intervention special education service grants. This, I believe, is ongoing in a Proposition 98 proposal. So this is really targeted towards some of the younger students that we see under 3. And I know that Erica probably has many more comments about that, and so she can probably give you some details since she's the head lobbyist on special education. There's also $265 million for community school expansion grants and to get community schools up and going. These are the schools that provide more like health services that you'd see. There's a few of them around the state that we can see that can use this funding. It's one time in nature, but it's to really address some of the issues that we're seeing in pandemic, according to the administration. The other big thing that we're seeing is that there is additional pay down in the CalPERS, CalSTRS pension relief. And so, we see this for the past couple years with this administration. It's been really, really helpful. We look forward to it, and we ask for it every single year. It ends up in our budget letter for fall. And so what that amounts to is about a reduction from 18.1% to 15.9% for STRS, and from 24.9% to 23% in PERS. Always good news when we can see some of those buy down relief. We saw last year in the Budget Act, or excuse me, in June in the Budget Act, that we saw supplemental and concentration grants. There were some additional changes to that because of concerns over how those funds were spent or unspent, and then maybe used for different purposes. So there's going to be additional language in this budget that we have yet pending. It's going to be related to the LCAP, and then as well as that information might be relayed on the dashboard, is what we're hearing from the state board right now. But we're looking to get more information and see what that language and how it actually pans out. Another thing that we saw that's going to be in the budget is that there was a lot of concern for some of the students that are in the most of need that weren't able to actually submit applications for FAFSAs, for student aid. And so there's going to be a requirement that all high school seniors have to apply for a FAFSA. So we'll see some of that language and have more detail for you as it comes out. Next slide, please. And now I'll turn it over to Dennis to talk about that $2 billion for in-person instruction.
Thank you, Cheryl. What's funny is you look at this $2 billion proposal for in-person instruction. It's only one of the things that Cheryl just went through. So Cheryl went through a couple of pages of some rather large ticket items. If you think about paying off 5 of 6 deferrals, that's a substantial chunk of change. But we know that this one proposal, for a couple reasons, is really going to be at the forefront of everyone's minds right now. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but what the governor's trying to do is try some sort of an incentive to reopen schools. And so saying, hey, well, how do we do it instead of just a state mandate? How do we do it? And so that's really kind of the genesis of this program. So the proposal is $2 billion in Prop 98 in current year. If you look through the trailer bill language, which some of the budget nerds will do, you'll see that there's also authorization for the Director of Finance to request more. So this is what would be budgeted, but then there's authorization to do more if this money runs out. What this would go for is a per ADA grant of $450 per ADA. This is the formula is similar to the LCFF formula, so this is like a base grant level. So if you're kind of, let's say, a low LCFF funded district, you'd get about $450 per ADA. If you're a high LCFF district, let's say with a really high unduplicated count, and like say the 90% rate, then your per ADA amount is going to be higher than that. Let's say maybe $650, $680, or $700, but the base amount is $450 per ADA. The application deadline is for February 1st of this year, right? So this is what, just 22 days away to apply for this money, to say that you will be offering in-person learning by February 15th. The grant amount will go down by 25% if the application is received by March 1st for starting in-person or offering in-person learning by March 15th. So there's a little bit of a variance there, but we wanted to highlight this February 1st deadline because it kind of implies that this is going to be a heavy lift for the legislature to do in such a short amount of time. Now, when a school district applies, there's several things that the school district has to do, and it's handing these plans and stuff to the County Office of Education, so they'll check to say yes, we've received it. It's implementing asymptomatic testing for employees, which has been on everyone's radar for a long time, but also for students. So that's kind of a new thought coming out of the administration about COVID-19 testing to include students as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit because that's like a new regimen that will be coming out in guidance that is being developed right now by the California Department of Public Health. We call that CDPH. We've seen guidance from them a few months ago. It's being updated to kind of parallel this program, and this new testing cadence will be included in there, including inclusion of Cal OSHA requirements, things like that. So that's the next thing in here is there's Cal OSHA regulations that were adopted a month ago. So there has to be indication that the district is complying with those and handing that plan over to the county office. Also, then part of the CDPH guidance that we'll see in a few days is going to include a checklist for districts to actually check off items on that checklist that they are doing. In addition to that, there has to be proof that the collective bargaining agreements have been approved that apply to this new program. Many of you have collective bargaining agreements that maybe would not need to be modified, or you have an MOU with your classified and with your certificated that might allow for this application to be submitted, but we're also thinking that probably most of you would still have to then reopen your contracts to address some of the issues of this new program. Part of the requirement then is that you would have to also certify that all of your students have devices and have access to high-speed internet. So again, another hurdle for this money. And also that in-person instruction. Now here's where we actually get to the instruction part. It has to be offered to TK through grade 2. That's kind of in the first phase. That's if you apply for the February 1 grant. You would start off TK to grade 2, and then a month later increase that TK to grade 6. So it's offer in-person instruction, knowing that there's going to be a contingent. If you do this, there's going to be a contingent of your employees, a contingent of your students and parents who are not going to feel safe coming back yet. And so you're offering in-person instruction to qualify for this grant. But then the realization is that you would still also have either hybrid model or distance learning going on in parts of your district. The other part of this is that you would have to be also ensuring in-person instruction for cohorts. So that's not a new term. We've known that since July. These are smaller groups of students. In the language, it says at least for special education, foster youth, homeless students, and students who do not have access to distance learning, but it can be broader than that too, so you could do cohorts. The reason why this cohort is important is not only does it apply to the K2 and then K6 population, but if you're a high school district or a unified district, this per ADA grant is for those higher grade levels too, but in those higher grade levels, grades 7 through 12, you would have to be offering these cohorts. So you could be a high school district offering these cohorts, but not open to in-person, and this money would still be available if you were to meet all of the little bulleted items here. Now, as I talked about, this application process is to the County Office of Education. For the local education agencies that are actually in purple counties, and we know the yellow, orange, red, purple progression on the seriousness of the COVID outbreaks for county. If you're in a purple county, then the application actually has to be sent to the local health jurisdiction, which has 5 days to notify you if it has not been accepted. So there's kind of a little bit nuance there if you're in a purple county. I think I read last night that everybody is in purple except for maybe 2 or 3 counties. So that looks like that's, if this was to pass right now, that would be the requirement. Next slide, please. What we are showing here is so we talked about the per ADA amount of $450. There is a necessary small school adjustment. So we just wrote the amounts here. And if you remember, I said if the application is received March 1st for March 15th implementation, that the $450 amount would go down by 25% to like $338. These amounts would also be reduced if the application was to offer in-person instruction starting March 15th instead of February 15th. So just note that in your mind that these would drop by 25%. Now, that's what that next bullet talks about. Now, eligible uses for the funds, really it's broad to just say it's anything related to reopening and offering in-person instruction. So it's PPE, it's this testing cadence that we'll talk about in a second, it's ventilation for your rooms. Also a nuance here is that it's also allowed for salaries for certificated and classified personnel providing in-person instruction or services. So there's something, it's not just some of the hard costs, but it's also to cover potential costs relating to employees as well, whether it's a bump in hourly rate for custodians during this period, or somehow to recruit more substitutes, things like that. It's not specified, but it just talks about that allowance. Now, let's talk about this yellow, red, purple counties. So the yellow, red, purple we have seen since the July Department of Public Health guidance on how the state is handling some of the allocation of resources. And this is all based on infection rates of COVID-19. In this new guidance, you'll see what they're calling like a deep purple. I don't think they call it that. That's what we're calling it kind of on our side. And that's when you're in a purple county. However, if your infection rate is 28 cases per 100,000. So most counties are kind of in purple right now, and a lot of your areas are even above this. So that kind of puts you in a deeper purple with much higher infection rates. And that's just kind of important to note, because if you're in those counties, you may qualify for this money for future reopening. You would be allowed to operate in your cohorts, but not if you're wanting to open K2 or transition kindergarten to grade 2 and you're purple. You wouldn't be able to reopen until you drop out of that deep purple, but you'd still be eligible for the funds. Also is a new reporting requirement. So with the new testing that we'll talk about in just a second, there's new reporting too. So there's, if your testing shows that you've got an infection, to say a teacher and 2 students at a school, there's requirements that you would then notify county health who those people are, their address, their phone numbers. So it's pretty interesting, the detailed information there. All right, last slide on this, go ahead. Go ahead and change slides, please. Lastly is just this testing cadence. Now this is really interesting because this is kind of new in line of what you have been thinking about for reopening your schools. So in the yellow to orange counties, the testing really is just symptomatic and response testing. So that's, as students are walking in, hey, how you feeling today? That kind of stuff, what's your temperature? As you then progress into the counties with more cases, then there's more requirements. So then moving to red and purple counties, it's the symptomatic and response testing, but then it's also asymptomatic testing every 2 weeks for students and employees. So that means that's the swab, putting it in the package, sending it off, having it processed, coming back on everybody who's actually back in-person learning every 2 weeks. And then if you're in deep purple, remember that was that high, the high incidence rate where it's above 28 cases per 100,000, then that testing has to happen once a week for all students and for all employees. So you can see here the level of testing that would be associated with wanting to apply for these funds. So there's the timing of this funds. Can you get your program together that fast? Can you put your testing together that fast? How much will this $450 per ADA grant allow you to do? Do you need more PPE? Do you need some of the plastic shields? Do you need more filtration? How much of this testing cadence is going to eat into that $450 per ADA? Those are all the things you need to consider. And already those are concerns that we've expressed, other organizations have expressed. Legislators have already expressed these kinds of nuances to this program. So the reason why I'm saying that is this just kind of gets you and your governance team thinking about this. But there's a long way between today and when and if this passes by the legislature in enough time for there to be any benefit locally. So more of this is going to be coming out later and discussed later, but we wanted to kind of highlight for you that there's a lot of boxes to check to qualify for this specific part of the governor's proposal. And like I said, there's a lot on your side, but then also a lot on the legislative side to get this passed in time. Usually it takes months for a bill to pass. Fast tracking something in a 1 or 2 or 3 week period that spends $2 billion, that really is a hard sell. And so there's a lot that this has to go through in the next few weeks, but we wanted you to know about it. I'm going to stop right there and then turn it back to Troy so that we can talk more to our special guests.
Thank you, Cheryl and Dennis. That was a very exhaustive presentation, and I appreciate you breaking down those numbers for us. We're going to go back to governmental relations in a little bit to get the federal perspective. That's important as well. But for now, we're going to concentrate on what's happening locally and statewide. And to help illuminate those issues for us, we have 2 special guests. I want to thank them for clearing time on one of the more hectic days of the calendar. So with us, we have Nancy Espinoza, a board member in the Elk Grove Unified School District here in the greater Sacramento area. And we also have Mackenzie Mays, an education reporter with Politico. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here, Troy.
Hey.
We will start with Mackenzie. Mackenzie, I know you have a background as a local education reporter in Fresno prior to coming to Politico and taking on the statewide beat. So I'm just wondering what you're hearing or what your impressions are in terms of how schools statewide are reacting to the governor's budget proposal.
Yeah, I mean, it's news. It's still fresh. So there's obviously a lot of celebration because it is good news. It is a windfall and record high education funding. More than we've ever seen. And comparatively, the last time we were talking about a state budget, it was not looking good. It was a dismal outlook. But now I think once everything sort of settles down, education advocates and the people here today listening and talking about this and school leaders, it's more about how the money can be spent and what's being said in the budget, maybe even more in the words than the numbers. And what I mean by that is we're seeing the governor step up and come out and say in this budget document, we want to see as many kids as possible in classrooms here's money and here's who is allowed to use it. And we talked about this earlier. You know, we talk about ADA generated funding. You know, I spoke with Newsom's finance officials just yesterday, and they said that, yeah, you know, that's on purpose. We're counting every head for money like we always do, but you are not allowed to use that money for distance learning. You can only use it for in-school purposes. And so I think that's what the focus is really going to be once these sort of celebrations about how much money we have settles down.
Great, I appreciate that perspective from the Department of Finance. That's interesting to hear. Nancy, how does this strike you? And is this a good budget from the perspective of Elk Grove, disappointing? How is that going to affect your operations in your school district?
It's a little bit of a mixed bag for us, Troy. You know, when we are used to the roller coaster that is education funding in the state of California, and you hear that your cost of living adjustment is going to be funded and 2/3 of the money that they owed you previously are going to be paid back, you can't help but breathe a sigh of relief. So that is absolutely good news. But the order of the day and the shared goal that we all have is getting students back in classrooms as soon as we can do so safely. So the fact that we have a lot of questions about the governor's plan, I think is kind of top of mind, certainly for me and a lot of school board members.
And when you mention those questions, what do you see as the biggest outstanding issues?
I think, you know, where I sit as a school board member, we really want to see how all of this is going to pencil out. Dennis talked about the concept of cadences. So depending on the prevalence of the virus, where you are, which level you're in, the recommended cadences vary. And we did some back of the envelope. So for my district, assuming about 62,000 ADA, but for the back of the envelope, we said, well, what if only 15,000 students choose to go in person at about 140, I think, per test? We would need, what is that, about 15,000 in the purple or red tier. If the case rate is in that super purple or deep purple that Dennis mentioned, we could be around in excess of 27,000. And doing my back of the envelope for that per pupil grant that the governor mentioned, if we become eligible in March, because we're definitely not going to be eligible by February 1st, we'd only get around 21 million. So that only covers, you know, part of the testing piece. It doesn't cover lots of the other things that we would need to put in place. The logistics, of course, is pretty incredible. You know, up until now, we've been one of the districts who's really had a good partnership with our county in terms of testing. But the idea that we would have to create our own testing operation, right? Even if you rely on healthcare as the tester of choice for your employees, what's the logistics of sending them there? I mean, how much time off are we going to need? We are already in a substitute shortage. Do you create your testing centers on site? So that's a lot to work out in a very short period of time. So we just are eager for the legislature to start its process so that we can get all those questions answered.
Absolutely. I know school districts throughout the state are grappling with many of those same questions. And you mentioned the legislature, so I would turn again to Mackenzie. This, of course, has to be approved by the legislature in a large part. So I'm curious what you're hearing about the receptiveness of people in the Assembly and the Senate to some of these proposals.
Yeah, the lawmakers I talked to leading up to this got a lot of what they wanted out of a budget proposal. Their number one thing was deferrals, and like we discussed, most of those have been wiped out and taken care of. It was such a priority that I spoke to lawmakers on budget committees just last week. And, you know, when Georgia took those seats in the Senate, and obviously we have a new president coming, when we think about a Democratic controlled federal, you know, level, we get a little optimistic, or more optimistic than we have been about federal aid that could go to states and maybe to schools. And when I talked to lawmakers, that was one of the first things they said was, oh, maybe we can use that money for the deferral problem. So to see that, you know, already on the governor's radar and us have the ability to do that, I think they are mostly happy. But, you know, this in-person thing is going to continue to be much more nuanced than we can even imagine. Lawmakers have written up their own separate legislation that takes an even firmer stance about getting schools back in and sort of forcing them more so than this does. And, you know, the governor was asked today by reporters, you know, what do you say to critics who say you should mandate schools to reopen instead of offering these incentives, because it seems clear that he does think schools should be open, at least elementary schools, even though everyone, you know, I think agrees that the timing couldn't be worse because of the surge, but we've gotten to such a long point now, almost a full year, and that I really think everyone's sort of panicking. But the governor said, you know, he's not going to do that, that he wants to work in collaboration, that he doesn't want to overstep this really long legacy of local control in California when it comes to school decisions.
Great, and we will welcome Nancy and Mackenzie back during the question and answer session, but I appreciate your input. That's definitely a unique perspective, and I think that's valuable to our members. We talked a little bit in that segment about potential help or assistance coming from the federal level. So we are going to turn to our expert on all things DC. That is CSBA Legislative Advocate Erica Hoff.
Thank you, Troy. I appreciate it. It took a while. It took a long while, actually, but we finally got a federal budget right before Christmas. Right after Christmas, excuse me. But we've actually got a federal budget, and you know, for education, it was pretty good. I mean, the total budget itself was 1.4 trillion. 73.5 billion of that is for education. About 40.6 is actually going to K-12. But it was an increase over last year. You know, a small percentage, but it was an increase. Title I grants were increased by about the largest percentage, to 16.5 billion nationally. IDEA also received a funding increase. And the great thing was, over the last couple of years of the 116th Congress, CSBA advocated really heavily for including funding to increase the funding for the little kids in special ed, you know, the birth through 5, both in Part C, which is the birth through 3, but then also for the kids that are 3 to 5 years old, because that's when education gets them. For the first time in a long time, there was actually a small increase of about $3.5 million to the Part C section, and there was about a $4.8 million increase to the Part B section for the 3 to 5 year olds. So I think that's something that we can all be grateful for. And this does tie in very closely with what the governor has been talking about in increasing the services on early education. So hopefully we can make that work together and provide better services and more connected services for those kids, for our youngest kids in special education. Excuse me. But the great thing was, in the federal budget, almost all the education programs received at least some small increases. I mean, they did a small increase in impact aid in McKinney-Vento. CTE actually got an increase this year. There was a fairly large increase to the child care and development block grants. Head Start got an increase. So, I mean, it was a pretty good year. Looking forward to next year's, the FY22 budget. Usually the president puts that out in February. The fact that President-elect Biden will be sworn in January 20th, most likely, I'm thinking beginning of March is probably when we'll see his budget proposal. But hopefully it will include the trend to further increase, especially the Title I funding and the IDEA funding. The president has talked, or President-elect has talked about fully funding IDEA up to the 40% promise. We'll see how long that takes. We all know it's multiple billions of hundreds of billions of dollars to get there. So, but that would also be of great benefit to the state of California. So it's going to be work. It's going to be fun. I mean, as you've seen with what's occurred with the changes in the U.S. Senate, we've got the 117th Congress has been sworn in, and with the inauguration coming up, and hopefully we'll be able to start off and really move the education agenda for all of us. You could go to the next slide. Thank you. I wanted to briefly talk to you about this last stimulus bill that was finally passed. This was part of the, this and the budget were hooked together into one piece of legislation. HR 133, for those that want to look it up. Just be warned, it's about 5,600 pages long. And it's a huge bill because it contains the whole Appropriations Act, basically the budget, and it contains the $900 billion for the COVID relief package. Education will get about $82 billion. The governor's emergency fund, which is the GEAR fund, it's about $4.1 billion, and the state just today received that appropriation. It's about $154 million for California. So their Department of Finances is looking at how they can put this together. Does it need to be included in legislation? Most likely it does. So this will be probably part of the budget discussions coming up. The ESSER funds, what we're now calling ESSER 2. It's a very similar program to what the original ESSER funds were. However, what they have done though is they've expanded the uses for the funds. So in addition to everything that you were able to do with the original set of ESSER funds, you can now also use these new ESSER 2 funds to address learning loss among students. You can use it for some facilities issues, especially those looking at the indoor air quality pieces. You can use it for testing and maintenance and repair and replacement of indoor air quality units for schools. So that's pretty good. There is a new set of reporting requirements that are going to be very detailed. Have not seen the information on that yet. But just so you know, out of the $53.4 billion that was provided under ESSER 2, excuse me, California, we did receive, and this just came in yesterday, we did receive about $6.7 billion. 90% of that money has to go out to local LEAs, and it'll go out on the Title I formula. So that will be coming out. The remaining 10%, that will be included in discussions with GEAR and how those funds are used, potentially to address some of the learning loss issues and the reopening issues that schools will be facing. So we're looking forward to all of that. As I said, a lot of this is really new. We've just gotten, these awards. There will be further information, and I will make sure to keep you all apprised of that. We'll be sending that out in our blast, but I will return it now to Troy, and we can move on with questions and answers.
Thank you, Erica. We appreciate the federal perspective. We will now enter the question and answer segment of the webinar. Again, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so using the question tab in the menu bar. Just type in your question and hit send, and we will try and get to it behind the scenes. We've already received quite a few questions. Many of them were related to the issue of deferrals. So I'll try and collapse those all into one question. We heard quite a bit from the governor in his announcement about this budget being the largest allocation to schools in history. Generally, each year is larger than the previous one, unless we're in a major recession. So that's not really too surprising. But getting into the details of that, this questioner notes that the governor's budget suggests they are giving schools $17 billion more than the current year, but the Prop 98 chart shows the year-over-year increase is barely $3 billion. And the questioner references the fact that some of that money is the restoring of deferrals. So the question is, isn't the administration taking advantage of restoring some of the deferrals that weren't needed in order to inflate the appearance of how much money is being given to schools? I will throw that one to you, Dennis, because you're at the top of the governmental relations food chain, so you have to answer these tough ones.
I know, but I'm looking at Cheryl's face here because he's like, yeah, I mean, it's very observant that someone would catch that, because that's exactly what the math looks like. So the budget that was adopted in June assumed massive reduction in the state general fund. A portion of that reduction actually happened. Most of it didn't. So Prop 98 was adopted, I think like 70 billion, 71 billion, which was here. And then the deferrals allowed districts to spend here, right? So what this budget says is, well, we didn't need to adopt this. So Prop 98 really is up here. So yeah, it shows this difference between the adopted budget and then where this budget is. But as the questioner already has figured out, is most of that is going towards repaying the deferrals, which gets you basically back to zero but with the ability to, I mean, they're still holding out, paying off the June apportionment, so we know that that's like $3+ billion. But there's a little bit that allows for the COLA, things like that too. So, you know, I've got to let Cheryl go here because she's got a good understanding of Prop 98. So Cheryl, I don't know if I did it justice, but if there's anything I left out, because I just think it's pretty, if Cheryl asked that question, I'd say it's because she understands 98, but to have that come from anybody from the field, it's very, very observant, and I'm glad that question was asked.
To answer your question directly, yes, that's exactly what it is. Nice catch, Kevin. I saw that one earlier when I was trying to answer everyone's questions as other people were talking. Yeah, that's what it is.
Good
All right,
catch.
well, that's directed to the point. We'll move on to the next question. And this comes from one of our school districts that's in a situation that not everyone is familiar with. We know that the vast majority of students are not on campus getting in-person instruction, but there are a significant number of school districts which are open, generally the smaller school districts that people may not be in regular contact with. So this person is affiliated with one of those districts, and she says, we are already open and one of the first in our area. We have all the documents needed to claim the 450 ADA, which is the grant, the base grant under the school reopening plan. My question is, are we automatically approved since we are already open and complied with all the requirements? We heard that this is not popular at this point, but since it is part of the budget, should they not pay or reimburse schools that already opened because it costs the district money? Thank you for any information.
Again, that's a good question because, yeah, and I didn't really highlight that. So yeah, if you're already open, you could qualify for this grant with the caveat that, yep, you've submitted your documents, right? And there's going to be a little bit of difference now because what they may not have done is provided like the Cal OSHA requirements to their county office. So that's number one. They're also going to have to update their school their safety plan to include this new testing cadence. So you could have been open and hybrid anywhere in the state. The difference is a couple of these nuances. So yeah, the intent is you can stay open, you can qualify, but you're going to have to meet a couple of these new requirements. And that testing cadence may be what may be kind of the breaking point for some of the districts out there.
The next question pertains to special education. The governor has always made a point of talking about special education in his budget announcements, referencing his own experience with special education. And this person wants to know, are there any aspects of the budget that prioritize and ensure FAPE for students with disabilities, with IEPs and 504 during COVID? Erica, do you want to tackle that?
At this point, I'll have to say no, and part of that is because we haven't seen the budget language yet. All we have seen is a summary of the budget. It does not, the summary doesn't specifically mention FAPE, but what will come through in either both the trailer bills and also in the actual budget bill is the detail of how they're looking at these programs. So give me about a month and a half. Hopefully by then I'll have some trailer bill language and I'll be able to look for that. But I'll keep that in mind as I'm going through it. And if we find something, we will make sure to get back to you.
Thanks, Erica. So one thing a lot of districts are encountering as they're contemplating the risk assessment or the trade-offs of reopening and when to reopen, if they do, is the issue of vaccination and how that would impact that decision. So one of our questioners wants to know is when will teachers be prioritized? And I would like to extend that also to staff, because it's not just certificate employees or teachers, it's all staff who have exposure risk. When are they going to be vaccinated? Because that's going to impact the decisions that a lot of governance teams are making.
Right. Well, you know, the state, I think it's called the Community Vaccination Committee, you know, there's a school board member on that, and they met this week. So we know now that as of Wednesday, there have been, I think it's like 490,000 vaccinations given in California. That's just a scratch, right? By the end of next week, the hope is to have that number raised to 1 million vaccinations. And these are all what's known as kind of Tier 1A. So these are frontline healthcare workers and then some very seriously ill people. Tier 1B is where education workers are. So it's teachers and classified. So I think there's, a few 100,000 more in that Tier 1A that have to be vaccinated. Then they get to Tier 1B. So also in Tier 1B though, it's education, which includes, you're always going to hear teachers, but our work so far has been successful to say, no, it's not just teachers, it's the entire school employee list, because everyone's needed to be, vaccinated to make sure the school can happen. But also in that 1B are agricultural workers, I think people over 75 years old, and then like paramedics, firefighters. And so that's all that's in that 1B, but our employees are in there as well. So it's like we're next, but getting from that, 1 million end of next week to the other 1.5 million vaccines that we need, that could be weeks or 1.5 months or 2 months out. That I don't know, but yeah, that push is still going on. The governor talked a little bit about that today. It's in his summary. They're working to get this all out, but the reopening plan, this $2 billion, doesn't tie into vaccinations, which is we're kind of thinking it should more than anything. But that's where we are. We're at the top of the second list, if that makes sense.
Thanks,
Hey,
Dennis.
Sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. I'll add to that because it's a related question. The reopening plan also doesn't address liability, which is something that school districts have tried to get last year. And it's not something we want to talk about, but the idea of losing a great deal of resources that we want to use to educate kids as a result of doing everything right, of following all the checklists and all of the prevention protocols is something that we have to worry about. So that is one thing I personally hope will come up in the legislature's deliberation.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Nancy. Thank you.
And Dennis, I think it's fair to say that's an issue that CSBA will pursue in the legislature this session, correct?
It's something we've been pursuing since about the middle of March, and we will not go away until that is addressed. As Nancy said, it's amazing. It eats up resources, and a district as large as Elk Grove is concerned about some court cases. Imagine if you're a district with 500 students and you could be facing the exact same settlement that perhaps Elk Grove is. It could wipe out your entire budget. So it's a big issue.
And next question, I know we covered this, but I think it's an important point that's worth revisiting, especially since a couple people have asked questions just related to the timing under the school reopening plan of when LEAs would have to submit their plan or get their plan approved, and then when they could expect to receive funding for school reopening if they do go that route.
I'll attempt to answer, but we've been, as a staff, looking at the actual language for that program. So I know that, the intent is that the initial intent is file your application February 1st for February 15th reopening. And there is language in there directing how the apportionments would come out. So I can't really remember because I was looking at all those little itty bitty bullets to submit. So I don't know if Becca or Shell, if you remember, the money would be coming out pretty fast, but I don't think you're going to get it February 2nd. But I mean, how does that work if you guys know?
I mean, I think that the infrastructure for the administration from the Department of Education is what's really going to determine the timing of that. I don't know. You can't statutorily set that, or you could, but it's not in there. But yeah, the initial application date for funding round 1, which is the 450 that everyone is familiar with, is February 1st. The funding round 2, which is $327 per ADA, is the deadline for that is March 1st. And then just to add on that a little bit, because I've been going through and looking at a lot of the questions, is that there's a question from several people about, well, what if you're in deep purple? Can you still get the grant? Yeah, you can, and you can still get the funds. You have a plan, but your county is where it is, and there's not a whole lot you can do, but you're doing your part and you're planning. And so if there's a concern of these funds have to be spent for in-person instruction, you do have a timeline up to December 31st of this year to spend those funds. So if you don't get a chance to open back up by June because of what your county circumstances are, you can still spend those money for the fall so long as they're for in-person instruction if you plan to open in the fall at some point. So just wanted to make that clear because it keeps coming up in the chat box or in the question box.
And if I can add too, one thing about the Department of Education is they're pretty good about getting money out the door. So let's say by some miracle this bill passes and 100 LEAs put in their February 1st application and they start qualifying for the money starting February 15th. I mean, I really think the Department of Ed would have started working on it back in the late part of January. So yeah, you might have to float a few weeks or a month, but the intent is to get that money out the door to you quickly. But we can't really answer that based on how fast the legislation passes, what the dollar amount, do they mess with the grant, do they put other hurdles in place, things like that. So we'll know more as this progresses. There's a lot of input that has to be put into this before it's fully cooked.
Okay, the next question, which I saw, I couldn't pass up because it's Dennis's absolute favorite topic. So I wanted to discuss the reserve cap. We had a couple questions about this budget triggering that down the line. So just discuss how that, well, first, describe the reserve cap for those who haven't been around as long and may not be familiar, and then talk about what it means that this budget would trigger it eventually.
Yeah, I'm glad you can only see me from the neck up because, I'm right now gripping my chair so much because this has just been a crazy issue for so long. But, I'll start with right now. Yeah, the law basically says, and I'm going to kind of skim through it real quick, that if, we're in a test 1 year, if general fund, if capital gains income in the general fund reaches a certain level, the state has to contribute to this public school safety stabilization account, something like that. And when that percentage gets a certain amount in that PSSSA, that's when this reserve cap happens. So what the governor's budget is saying is, hey, that's going to happen in the budget year, meaning 21-22, and the way the law is written is in the following year, then school district reserves would be capped at 10%. And now we're going to get a little detail here of their assigned and unassigned reserves. Assigned and unassigned basically is an administrative act that your budget staff take when there's unspent money. So you may have budgeted 50,000 for this, spent 48. That unspent money gets parked over here into your reserve and it sits there until it is spent or put somewhere else. Those are assigned and unassigned. So when this first happened, we went crazy because this is such an assault on school board governance. So we got the law completely changed to where it's almost non-existent anymore, but the state still has its part. So not only does it take a couple billion off the table, which we would think probably should be going out to you all anyway, but the way this reserve cap works is all small school districts are exempted. So that's part of the legislation that we sponsored. That's 2,500 and less in your average daily attendance, completely exempted, so that doesn't apply to you. All basic aid districts, that's like another 80 districts or so that it doesn't apply to you. So if you're in one of the remaining 400 districts, you're thinking, but it applies to me. Well, maybe. All that you have to do is keep your reserves and unassigned under 10%, and or you then just have the board act to commit these funds. So you can still have reserves. It's just that now the board has to have it agendized, say, well, we're going to commit these funds to this purpose. A purpose could be a general reserve, or a purpose could be school bus replacement, or you list it, but as long as the board commits the funds, then it doesn't apply, the cap doesn't apply to those funds. So, we were very careful in making sure that this had minimal impact. So right now the impact is it takes a few $1 billion off of the allocation out to school districts. That part, I think, is something that would still need to be addressed in the Constitution, but at least legislatively we got the other part fixed. So it's as long as you think it through, it's not that much of a challenge. And we know that the chief business officials and others in your budget staff know about this, and we'll be working school boards through that process over the next 12 months.
Thanks, Dennis. We appreciate the history lesson, and it has proved to be relevant. At the time CSBA was pushing for legislation on the reserve cap. Some scoffed and said it would never happen. So you had a lot of foresight, and so did your colleagues. Pushing.
Oh, hey, Troy, can I interrupt you there? I mean, I don't know how much time we got, but I wanted to kind of give just kind of a big shout out to school board members, because the lobbying that they do, I mean, we may say, hey, this is important. If you can meet with legislators and talk about these 3 things, we know that there's hundreds of meetings that go on throughout the year. And that's why we're kind of claiming, some excitement about, the COLAs, about payment of deferrals. When Mackenzie said every legislator she talked about, deferrals are at the top of the list. Well, duh, school board members have been talking to their legislators for months, right? But on that reserve cap, it really was CSBA. So many people told us it's never going to happen. There's never going to be a test one year. And we said, oh no, this could happen. This is real. And, just 2 years after SB 751 passed by now retired Senator Jerry Hill from San Mateo, now we're in test 1 year, and we're in test 1 year for a couple of years now. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because it is a big deal, and it talks about the importance about school board members talking on a consistent basis with legislators. So we didn't really tee this up, but you did tee it up, so thanks a lot.
Absolutely. We have another question that acknowledges there are a lot of different stakeholders in school districts. Of course, we focus a lot on governing boards, but there's also the labor piece of making schools work, which is very important, particularly in this unusual time when we're trying to reach agreements and doing things we've never done before in schools. So one question that one of our members asked is, what support can be expected from the state in regards to encouraging labor unions, or making them feel comfortable that it's safe for their members to return to work. And then more specifically, they asked, do you think that the unions statewide will generally endorse returning to school to on-campus instruction before everyone is vaccinated on staff? And I'd like to give Mackenzie a shot at answering that. I know that you're in contact with some of the unions, and what feeling are you getting from those conversations?
It's a great question. I think everything we talked about today, every piece of the budget, the very next question is, you can't pull any of this off without a workforce. So when we talk about learning loss recovery in summer school, immediately the question is, what teachers are willing to work in the summer, and how do we pay them for that? When we talk about learning in person, the governor made in his budget today that the use of that spending for the in-person instruction grants so wide that you can use it for teacher salaries. But they said not distance learning teachers. We don't really know what that means. Does that mean we're talking about like combat pay here, or are we talking about hiring teachers to be in person? But they're basically saying, do what you want, but you have to be in person to get it, whether you're a student or a teacher. So I think that's a big deal. And it's been so interesting to watch this sort of tick up and up over the past year, because at first it was about, the unions asked for more funding because they needed testing and stuff like that. Now we have funding. We still don't have the testing that we need, but districts have moved ahead on their own, like LA, San Diego, have pretty massive budgets and have said, okay, we'll take it into our own hands. And now we're so close to a vaccine that the timing is so complicated that it's like, it is a good question. Does the vaccine have to be here? And they are prioritized like they asked to be, but we have no idea when it's going to come. My colleague is an excellent health reporter, and she is asking every day there's a lot of technical difficulties with this vaccine rollout, not just in California, but across the country. And now we're having this conversation where people have reached their breaking point at a time where it's worse than ever. These case rates are way worse than they were in the beginning of this, but we have this sort of collective fatigue, I think. And at the same time, you talk to parents and teachers, and the distance learning, it's not working. So I think we're all asking. I know that the biggest districts, and I'm sure that you saw this, but the biggest districts in the state had issues with the governor's reopening plan. They are really worried that it's basically rewarding schools for things they can't control, like community case rates of COVID. And they're worried about our most at-risk students, like students of color, low-income students. And the governor today said he felt that the budget addresses that, because he does prioritize those kids, but it becomes a sort of chicken or egg conversation, because what if, we also know at the same time that those kids are more likely to live in zip codes that have higher rates or are in the purple tier or might be slower to get out of there. So, it's like the administration is trying to be safe and set some public health standards, but then we might not be able to reach our kids who need school the most. And so then it comes to, do you open schools at the worst time possible? There are people in other states, governors in other states who have said, close the bars, close the restaurants, whatever you do, don't close the schools. But that's a lot more complicated than it sounds.
Thanks, Mackenzie.
Troy, if I could just to play into that, today, I saw a notice the LA County Health Officer is basically saying shut down the schools for the next 3 weeks because of the numbers in LA. And those are a lot of the zip codes and a lot of the kids we're talking about that the governor spoke to with the need to try to get more funding and try to get them back into a classroom so that their education can continue.
That's a good point, Erica. And Suzanne, that's next door to you. So I'm curious, in your role as CSBA president, what are you hearing from your peer trustees around the state about their response to the budget and generally to the prospect of school reopening and the plan the governor put forth? I think we may have lost Suzanne, probably a brief technical difficulty. So I will pitch that to the other school board member on the panel, Nancy. And if you could talk about the big school district perspective. A lot of people outside of Sacramento may not realize that Elk Grove is the 7th largest school district in the state, and you're actually larger than a lot of these big urbans that signed the letter. And you border the city of Sacramento. You have a lot of what would be called stereotypically urban areas and some of the same concerns that a lot of the urban districts do. So how is Elk Grove feeling about this?
You have Suzanne back. Do you want her to go first?
Yeah, no, just roll and then we'll go to Suzanne next.
Okay. I really, I feel very deeply what Mackenzie said about, are we just rewarding school districts for things beyond their control? And conversely, are we penalizing school districts for things beyond their control? This is what we have been saying from the very beginning. We want to educate your children in person. We want to provide the best possible experience. That's why we've been, begging and pleading members of our community, connected or unconnected to the school district, to do everything they can to lower transmission rates in our community. We are where we are, and it's going to take some time for these case rates to come down, even if if everything starts trending positive. My own district, I want to say 3 different times, we have tried to come back to do a hybrid or some form of in-person instruction. And every time we were about to approve that, the numbers started trending in the wrong direction. So I think our folks who we serve, our students, our families, our employees are probably really tired of those cycles. And that's part of what, sorry, there's a whiny dog in here. That's part of what I think lends to the fatigue, and that lack of predictability is part of what's exhausting. I do applaud those districts that you mentioned. I think Troy, LA, San Diego, others who have been able to initiate their own testing. That is excellent. I have a lot of questions about how they were able to do that, and those play into how we'll be able to do what's being asked of us now, including, the confidentiality issues, having folks share their results with us. What do you do about families who don't want their kids tested? We've been hearing about some counties in the Inland Empire, for example, where even among healthcare workers, they're declining the vaccine. Folks are declining to be tested. Folks who do test positive decline to participate in the tracing process. So those things are very real, and will we as school districts penalized for that? Again, those are factors beyond our control. So just a lot of questions remain for us.
Great, thanks, Nancy. I appreciate that. And for the statewide perspective, Suzanne, just wondering what you're hearing from your colleagues about the governor's budget and the prospect of school reopening, and then also what you're hearing from parents.
Yes, so definitely what I said in my statement is true across the state. And whether you're a teacher, and we have teachers in the family who are here in the South, you know we've been very affected by the COVID. So again, what was heard already today, we're talking about liability. We're talking about the ability to stay open, right? Not open and then have to close and then reopen. And I think that's hopefully going to be addressed, as we said earlier, that people are understanding there's liability issues, there's funding issues. And for those of us who know we have to catch up, which is across the board, the state, I heard that most vividly from when I talked to school board associations, where they realize what the gap is between the learning, which has been going on since we first closed down. We have to address it. But going back to what we were all stating, we need those special education funds. We need summer school funds. We can't be restricted by whether it's in person versus, distance learning. We have to catch up. And so from a parent perspective, the same, we are one of the unusual ones. We are currently open. And so the reality is, even in the North, I have friends who are obviously in areas impacted as well. It's the constant opening and closing. So I think overall, CSBA is doing a good job at the state level to address as many needs as I've heard from the local trustees and how we are feeling here in our own local district. So I appreciate the work of all the people on the surveys who let us know what we need to work on. And I think that's the thing I've been most impressed about this year. So I hope I've answered your question, Troy.
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate that. We also have a GAN limit question, and what are the implications for K-12 schools of the state hitting its GAN limit?
Come on, that had to be a plant. Well, I laugh at that because, the GAN limit, hasn't really been in play for, man, I'm just trying to do some math here, 20 something years, I think the last time. So we were talking about that at the staff level. And I know that there is some thought about this maybe coming up to the GAN limit for the state and what happens. And I got to tell you, I need to go brush things off because I know there's requirements for money to go back to taxpayers and something to go to school. So I don't know, Cheryl or Erica, if you had time to delve into that or getting that question answered from the Department of Finance.
I didn't have time. Go ahead, Cheryl, sorry.
I asked this question to my colleagues because it was something that was coming up when I was still at the Department of Finance, and I don't think there's a solution for it right now. I think it's something that they're still discussing at this point, recognizing how close we are. So
yeah, even the governor mentioned that they probably won't know for sure anything until May when we get those updated numbers. Keep in mind, the last time the GAN limit was triggered, it was either 86, I think it was 86. 80, no, it was 86. 89 is too late. So it was 86. Back in the way beginning of when we started in this mess, Dennis.
We also had a couple questions about ADA. We know that districts, because of all the disruption and impact on attendance, were held harmless for this year. They're wondering how long that is going to extend for, will it roll over into 21, 22, and beyond? Are there any indications about that?
Cheryl, do you want to take that one?
I'm sorry, it cut out a little bit. Can you repeat the question?
Wondering if the hold harmless clause or provision relative to ADA will be extended into this upcoming 21-22 school year.
No, it won't. But Prop 98 already has a hold harmless in a way, so that's something to think about. And something that was discussed heavily during the discussions in the spring is that you already have the ability to grab the hold harmless of whatever year that you previously had, except for charters. They don't have that same ability to do that. So if your 1920 ADA was higher than your 2021, which, that's understood, you could still use that ADA so that you could be able to maintain services until you start making further plans.
Thanks, Cheryl. And then we have one question that we touched on in a little bit before, but it's slightly different angle here. And they're wondering if they already have an agreement to return to school for the TK to 2, and that agreement predated this school reopening plan, but may be different in some aspects. Would they have to revise or renegotiate, or does their existing plan stand as is?
That's an issue for an attorney. I mean, anything related to this, you're going to have to consult with your legal staff, because of the implications. Just as you said, you may think, oh, we're fine. So yeah, I mean, just stay out of trouble, get some legal counsel on that issue, because you want to make sure you do this right.
Well, and one thing to keep in mind too with all of this, what's been proposed so far is just that it's a proposal on the school reopening plans. This still has to go through legislation. We've seen one small piece of draft language. It's not been formalized yet. This will get amended and changed as it goes through the legislative process.
Right.
So this is just kind of like the opening salvo on this, in something that he wants to get done in 3 weeks.
Great.
So this is going to be interesting because the timing is just going to be real tight.
Yeah, I agree with that. And our general counsel is texting me, and he agrees that you have to look at each agreement on its own, and so you can't come to any blanket assumptions. So please do check with your counsel. Also had another question that's fairly technical, but I think it's worth going into. This person is asking, what happens if the case rate drops as of the last day of the month? Is it expected that schools would reopen the first day of the month? What if that doesn't happen until May? Would schools be expected to open for the few days in June that were on the school calendar? I guess this is assuming participation in the reopening plan.
That is incredibly specific. I think, and we're assuming that they received funds. Is the concern?
I think the question is, they're assuming they apply for the school reopening plan, they get funds, but then the case rate goes up and it doesn't drop again until what would be the end of the normal school year, and it would be silly to come back for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or something like that. How would that work?
I know the language talks about when you come back, and there's a little bit of time. It's an X number of days, but I don't know. We'd have to look, and then we can post this on the website as well. But I'm not sure if it says, and if you only have X number of days left of your school year. I don't know that it says that. So it may sound silly to come back for 5 days, but it may not. Or you could try to then extend your year another 10 for learning loss. I mean, there's several different options to go here.
And then Erica mentioned that this still has to go to the legislature, and Mackenzie talked a lot about some of the politics and wrangling that's going on. But one person specifically wanted to know what the education and budget chairs have to think. Have they said anything publicly about the reopening plans or the budget that might give us a little window into their mindset?
Maybe Mackenzie.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm looking at Mackenzie for that.
It's in my inbox actually, but it's not anything juicy yet. So, you know, like I said, they're happy with those deferrals. They have legislation and ideas up their own sleeves that are outside of this budget. We've got legislation proposals, not just for, you know, sort of forcing schools back, but also proposals that are pretty similar to what we see in the budget about learning recovery loss. You know, Lorena Gonzalez has her own bill that would go further on that. She wants to normalize redoing the school year. She wants to normalize summer school. It could be weekend school, night school, you name it, you know. So I think that they're thrilled that they're not facing, you know, this negative. There are a lot of states who are facing deficits even for their education, you know, budgets at the worst possible time, which is right now. So I think people, you know, the honeymoon might be over soon, but for right now, the budget chairs and the education chairs are happy. I think it's going to take some budget trailer bill language and specifics that we're all sort of waiting on to really know.
Great, thanks, Mackenzie. So really, it's TBD in the legislature, and I think that's a good note to end on. We're almost at our 4:30 limit. So before we conclude today, just wanted to leave you with some resources that you can use to get more information about the current budget situation and about COVID in general. So Nessa, if you would advance the slide, please. So we encourage you to visit csba.org coronavirus. From there, you can link to our YouTube channel where we have not only this webinar, but webinars on all sorts of topics that we've been doing for the last 9 or 10 months or so, and a lot of key resources on dealing with schools in the pandemic. Or you can go directly to our CSBA video channel on YouTube. Today's event is being recorded and will be up there on the website and on YouTube sometime on Monday, if not earlier. So thank you everybody for coming today and for bearing with us on a Friday afternoon. To our members or to other people who have questions about California schools, do not hesitate to contact us. And to all today's presenters, especially Mackenzie and Nancy, we thank you for joining us. Have a good weekend, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everybody.